What's up, people? I'm Shaggy, the opinionated hippie, and today I'm going to start a long deep dive into Deep Purple's live albums. Haven't listened to Deep Purple in a while after I did like the studio deep dive on this channel. I've revisited two albums mainly, but I'm feeling that Deep Purple urge again, so I know I'm going to go into like probably a month long if I indulgence of Deep Purple where I listen to them, often. So I thought I would take advantage of this and do the live albums, as many as I can before I get tired. And I'm not sure I'm going to get tired because even their more recent stuff, I really, really enjoy because it takes the newer songs and mixes them with what I always think is an interesting selection of older tracks, and it highlights different things in both. And so I've always been a fan of even their more recent live stuff. But we're going to start at the beginning, way back in the performance was 1969. I don't think this album was dropped. Yeah, it was dropped at the end of 69. Their first official live album, Concerto for Group and Orchestra. The concerto was written by John Lord. There are lyrics in one of the sections that Ian wrote, and I think this is the first time Ian ever appeared with the band. I also think it was the first time Glover appeared with the band. The original album, which is the one I'm going to mainly focus on today because that's the one I know, had 4 tracks. There were 3 movements, and the first movement was in its entirety. The second movement, which was the longest of them, was broken up into 2 different sections. I think it was the longest of them. Maybe not. I think the first movement might have been a little bit longer. But the second movement was broken up, and then the third movement had its own track. Later on, they re-released the entire show, and that included 3 tracks from Deep Purple, just the band. They did Hush, which sounds fantastic. I think Blackmore has a little more edge in this version of Hush. Wring That Neck, which allowed Blackmore and Lord longer solo sections. I think Blackmore got more than Lord did, including where he just gets a solo by himself. Very dynamic solo sections. The band's involved. It's very playful, a lot of like stop and go type action. Really good performance of Wring That Neck. And then a version of Child in Time, which is fantastic. One of the interesting things I've always found about Child in Time is there are performances where I feel like Blackmore does not care what the rhythm section is doing at all. And it almost sounds like a Xenochrony where like Blackmore's solo was recorded separately and just overlaid whatever the rhythm section was doing. This Child in Time, I feel like they're more in sync. Blackmore is still just going 100 miles per hour, but it seems like he's hitting the downbeats in a way that like it feels like, okay, they're in the same room playing. But really 3 really strong performances. The other additional track that was included in the more recent one was the show opened with the orchestra, which in this case I think is the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra. The whole thing was recorded at the Royal Albert Hall. They do a single, like a 25-minute classical music piece just by themselves. And that opens up the entire album. And I believe that it opened up the entire show. But the interesting part of this, the original album, are the 3 movements that Lord wrote that feature both the orchestra and the band. And it's not like the orchestra is backing up the band, nor is it like the band is backing up the orchestra. It really feels like the orchestra and the band are almost battling the entire time and are like opposing forces that are vying for space. The image I think of mentally is the movie Scott Pilgrim versus the World, the scene when he's fighting the 2 evil exes who are DJs, and Scott's band is on one side of the arena and the DJs are on the other, and as they play their music, like these like dragons or these creatures come up and battle. That almost is what this kind of sounds like, is like the orchestra is over here and they get their say, and the band is over here and they get their say. And sometimes they're going at it. Other times they're kind of just showing off by themselves. And it works. I think it requires the orchestra to be better because they don't have the band. It requires the band to be more interesting because they don't have the orchestra. And I think it's a fascinating like maybe 80% of the music is just one or the other playing and not both. Maybe even higher than that, to be honest. Maybe like 90%. I do think the orchestra gets more time than the band. It feels like maybe that's like a 60-40 or even a 70-30 type split. Um, but every time the band pops up, they're doing some really, really, really good things. Um, one more thing. Oh, the music that the orchestra is playing does feel like program music, does feel like something that would work in like Fantasia, like there is sort of an actual narrative that could be like illustrated and this could be the soundtrack to something. So it is that kind of classical music, but it works, especially when you have this band as the opposing force that comes in. Um, so the first movement, it's about 20 minutes long. All the movements are titled by the tempo of the music. So the first one is moderato. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. To allegro. So it's kind of upbeat, kind of festive, kind of happy, kind of joyful. The opening track opens up with about almost 8 minutes of orchestral music. Very much feels like the opening theme to a movie, very much like title music, maybe a little like background information that's going on while it plays. At one point, it kind of like breaks down and gets really quiet before it kind of builds back up. Sounds like bees are entering and things are like getting a little more crazy before we get back to this almost like frolicking, Fantasia esque type mushrooms dancing around type vibe. And that whole opening section is about 8 minutes long. And then the band drops in. And the band drops in with instrumental section that's like about 5 minutes long, maybe about 4.5 minutes long, of just them just like playing like the same motif the orchestra played, then just a jam. Just, I think Blackmore solos just goes on and on and on and on and on. It's a really nice solo by Blackmore. It's a really loose, jammy section by the band. Kind of reminds me of Frank Zappa's Billy the Mountain. If you're only familiar with the Just Another Band from LA version, Frank edited out the solo section in that one. But if you hear Carnegie Hall from Zappa or the Fillmore 71 box set, or the Mother 71 box set, which has shows from the Fillmore, there's a jam session towards the end of Billy the Mountain, which Frank solos, Preston solos, different instrument solos. And this solo section, when the band drops in, kind of reminds me of that Billy the Mountain vibe, where it simply exists to like frame solos. And it's really good. It's loose, it's jammy. Blackmore sounds absolutely incredible. The orchestra eventually returns, and it feels like the rest of this, there's like about a minute and a half of like orchestra band. Then the band comes back in. Lord gets a little chance to do like an organ solo. Then we get like Blackmore by himself, where everybody else drops out, and Blackmore gets like a solo guitar section, like they're battling for space. Then towards the end of it, the clarinet comes in and gets to like its own solo space. The clarinet that started the entire thing, the beginning of the first movement, starts off with this very sort of like ominous kind of clarinet coming out of the desert type motif. Not specifically Middle Eastern, but the images of like are like a grand Sahara desert, and like some lone rider happens to be the clarinet, just kind of coming out before the full orchestra comes in, and we get like this title music type stuff. A really interesting and fascinating opening first movement. Just really, really solid stuff. And I'm not a huge classical music fan, but the weight and the anticipation, knowing that the Deep Purple is going to drop in at one time and just provide an awesome, awesome jam rock session, makes everything worthwhile and really makes the listening enjoyable. The second movement is called Andante, which is like walking music. So it's a slower, kind of steadier pace, a little more deliberate. The orchestral stuff starts with an orchestral section. Very slow and deliberate, more of a dramatic type build for this part. The melodies and the ideas seem a lot more casual, a lot more laid back. kind of pretty chill thing. This goes on for close to 5 minutes before the band drops in, and we get like a short little minute where Ian sings, and it's almost like an early 60s kind of pop vibe, kind of slow, but pretty interesting. And then the band, and then that's the short part of on the original album. The initial when the second movement was split into two parts, that's the where the split happens. And then after we get the short little Deep Purple song with Ian singing, it gets really quiet. The band and the orchestra seem to come in at the same time, kind of rebuilding from the quiet. We get some nice cymbal action. We get the organ playing. We get the orchestral stuff. And then the orchestra completely takes over for a while. Reminds me of sort of like a dusky type vibe, like late at night. It's kind of calm, but there's like a sort of a seeping eeriness that's coming in, kind of melancholy. And then 4.5 minutes into that, the band drops in. We get some more really jammy blues action. Richie gets to play, and it's absolutely awesome. We got some lyrics in this part also. And then we get the first hybrid section. There's some really tasty guitar in here. We get like a solo organ section, and then we kind of get this quiet outro to finish up the second movement. And then we go into the sort of dramatic final third part. There's this is labeled vivace to presto, so we're up tempo. We're getting much faster here. There's some urgency to what the orchestra is playing, and then the band comes in at about 2 minutes, and then we get the final sort of hybrid section. It feels like a free-for-all. We get some changing time signatures that come throughout this, some really aggressive Ritchie Blackmore soloing. We get an organ solo. The orchestra seems to be doing its solo stuff. And because it's Deep Purple, about 6.5 minutes in, we get about a 5-minute drum solo. So yeah. We get a drum solo. They managed to squeeze a drum solo into this thing. Lasts for about 5 minutes. And then at the end, after the drum solo, about 4 minutes left in the song, the orchestra returns, and then the band comes back in, and then they go at it for one last time, and it feels like they just kind of battle towards the end. Yeah, it's just really kind of interesting, fascinating stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I really enjoy it. I don't know where the classical music would rank among like people who love classical music. I don't know if they would find anything interesting in this, but I do really like the way they balance the actual Deep Purple hard rock energy with the orchestral energy. I believe that it was only performed twice back in the 60s or early 70s because the score for the orchestral stuff was lost. And then I think decades later, they performed it again as I think Lord maybe recomposed it or rewrote it or something like that. But yeah, it's an interesting live debut for a hard rock band that probably only could have happened in or was absolutely perfectly suited for the late 60s and early 70s when rock music was literally just exploring every venue and trying to see what its limitations were and what its opportunities were and what it could do and what it could be. And yeah, I mean, in a way, cutting edge. We know still to this day there are metal bands who love to perform with symphonies. And Metallica, one of the biggest, metal bands, did it. So we know a lot of European bands do it. But anyways, yeah. So as a debut live album, I think it's a fascinating listen. I'm going to rank these as I go along. Right now, it's obviously ranked as number one. Don't know if it's going to stay there for long, for lots of reasons. But yeah, for now, it's got that number one spot. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Deep Purple's live album, their first one. Let me know what you think of this. If you're a classical music fan and you know about classical music more than I do, would love to know your thoughts on the classical aspect of this, things I messed up on, things I nailed. Anything like that. But yeah, that's all I got. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, like, share, comment, do those things. And if you haven't checked this out, check it out. You might like it. You might not. You don't know till you try. All right. Peace. Talk to you later.